In addition, we've enabled closed captioning for this event for accessibility, so captions should appear at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to thank Ben Hunkler, the communications manager for the Ohio River Valley Institute, who's coordinated this event and who's here today in case you have any technical issues with the meeting. So for the format of today's event, we'll begin with Louis Crack, Energy Infrastructure Coordinator with the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, who will share an overview of the state's Reducing Industrial Sector Emissions in Pennsylvania, or RISE Pennsylvania program. Then we'll hear a presentation from the research team at Strategen Consulting to present a new report, a roadmap for industrial decarbonization in Pennsylvania. A link to view and download the report will be available in the chat, so please feel free to navigate there if you'd like to follow along with the report. Following these presentations, we'll have time to field questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, please use the Q&A or chat function, and I'll do my best to see that we get through as many questions as we can in the time we have. And if there are questions we don't have time to address during the event, we'll make sure to follow up with you directly afterward. So thank you all again for joining us today as we release a roadmap for industrial decarbonization in Pennsylvania. And now please join me in a warm welcome for Louis Crack. Louis.
Thank you so much, Joanne, and many thanks to Orvi for having me speak here today and for the wonderful work of Strategen that we're celebrating. As Joanne mentioned, I am an energy infrastructure coordinator with the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, and I'm also part of a broader team, the Governor's Office of Critical Investments, and the purpose of our office is to leverage as much federal funding from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and Inflation Reduction Act to drive forward transformative projects across Pennsylvania. And so the biggest item in my portfolio at the current moment is the RISE PA program, which I'm very excited to share details with you. So the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection is proposing to create a statewide industrial decarbonization incentive program called Reducing Industrial Sector Emissions in Pennsylvania, or RISE PA. You gotta love a good acronym. I'd be a poor government employee if I didn't come up with a good one for this program. And the purpose of RISE PA is to reduce greenhouse gas and other co-pollutant emissions from Pennsylvania's industrial sector. The industrial sector is the highest emitting sector across the Commonwealth and accounts for just over 30% of Pennsylvania's total greenhouse gas emissions. And the goal of RISE PA is to offer grants for small, medium, and large-scale decarbonization projects at industrial facilities in Pennsylvania, with funding that we're really hoping to secure from the Environmental Protection Agency's climate pollution reduction grants, again, to reduce GHGs and co-pollutant emissions. And so our intent is to apply for $500 million, which is the maximum award under the climate pollution reduction grants, because industrial emissions are not only costly, but also difficult to abate. And now, like, 500 million may seem like a lot of money, and it certainly is. There's a lot of zeros in that number, but we feel that our ask is further justified by the findings of this awesome Roadmap for Industrial Decarb in Pennsylvania report, because, you know, according to Strategen's great work, it's going to cost $34.6 billion to achieve an 84% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2050. So really, 500 million is a drop in the bucket compared to that staggering figure. So to give you a little background about how we got to where we are today, at the end of December, DEP issued a request for information to solicit feedback from industry and other interested parties on an initial proposed program design for RISE PA. And we were very pleased to have received robust interest and input. We got a total of 39 responses. And since the RFI closed, we've been working to revise and finalize the program design to reflect and incorporate that awesome feedback we received. And so now, pleased to say we are in the process of actually writing our $500 million application, which includes the final program design for RISE PA, and that application is due to EPA on April 1st. And we are also soliciting for and have begun to receive letters of support from industrial companies that have projects that they want to submit to RISE PA, should we be lucky enough to receive funding for the program. And we're also getting letters of support from labor organizations and environmental groups that are also very excited about this initiative. So just a final note on the timeline, EPA anticipates announcing awards for the climate pollution reduction grants this summer, potentially as early as July. So we'll be monitoring that very closely. And to give you a little peek behind the veil about what the final program design entails, I'm going to give you a quick high-level overview now. So as I already mentioned, the main objective of RISE PA is to offer grants for greenhouse gas emissions reductions projects, or GERPs. Gotta love, another clunky acronym there. But so the GERPs must deploy one or more of the following greenhouse gas reduction measures that are outlined in DEP's Priority Climate Action Plan, which we're also wrapping up. And so those measures include industrial electrification, efficiency and process emissions, low carbon fuels, on-site renewable energy, carbon capture utilization and storage, and fugitive emissions reductions. So the GERPs must address emissions that are fall within the industrial sector as defined by the annual greenhouse gas inventory that DEP does every year. And so the industrial emissions stem from 4 subsectors: industrial fossil fuel combustion, natural gas and oil systems, industrial processes, and emissions from coal mining and abandoned coal mines. And we would also be looking to accept GERPs that reduce emissions from industrial electricity usage, even though technically those emissions are accounted for within the electricity sector in the greenhouse gas inventory. So, what constitutes a GERP? I know that must be top of mind for everyone listening. So the definition of a GERP was intentionally left very broad to allow for innovative projects and technologies. And some examples of eligible types of technology include things like electric heat pumps, combined heat and power systems, thermal storage technologies, and other heating systems that are electricity-based, as well as things like clean hydrogen, biomass, or waste heat recovery. We'd also be looking to fund projects that incorporate industrial heat pumps or insulation, sensors, controls, advanced recycling approaches, or smart energy management, types of energy efficiency technologies. And then, we're leaving room for other types of technologies as well that would electrify direct fuel use processes or adopt renewable or low emission fuels. But really, the limitation is your imagination in coming up with potential projects. And so DEP would be issuing awards under RISE PA across 3 award tracks. There's the small scale award track that's an exclusive carve out for small and medium sized manufacturers. And so these would likely be projects that are based on energy efficiency principles. Then you have the medium scale award track, which would be for mid-sized projects and would require a minimum 20% reduction in the total greenhouse gas emissions at the industrial facility where the project would be implemented. And lastly, we have projects submitted to the large scale award track that also have to meet that 20% reduction minimum threshold. And these we're really looking to fund big, bold, transformative, and innovative projects in this bucket. So the last key piece of program design I'm very excited to share is that there will be bonus adders available that increase the award size for projects that go above and beyond the standard requirements. to qualify for what we're calling the community benefits bonus, which is available across all 3 award tracks. A project has to be located in a low income and disadvantaged community as defined by the federal Community and Economic Justice Screening Tool, or CJEST. That's a requirement of the CPRG program. And so it has to be located in one of those communities, and also the applicant must complete and submit a community benefits plan. So projects in all 3 award tracks are also eligible to receive what we're calling the fair labor bonus for going above and beyond the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements that all projects must satisfy. And the fair labor bonus will require applicants to initiate good neighbor agreements to ensure access to jobs and business opportunities for local residents, as well as make collective bargaining commitments, just to name a few components. And then lastly, projects in the medium and large scale award tracks would be eligible to receive a third bonus. Get ready for another killer acronym here. So this bonus is the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Bonus. You got it, the GERB. Just rolls right off the tongue. So the GERB will increase the base award for projects that exceed the 20% emissions reduction threshold. So that is RISE PA in a nutshell, and we are crossing all of our appendages in hopes that we will receive funding to actually bring this innovative, first of a kind, and first in the nation program to fruition. And so I just want to end and close by saying a huge thank you again to Joanne and the team at Orvie and Joe and the team at Stratagen for their tremendous help in, bringing RISE PA to life, and for offering me the opportunity to share our journey with you all today. And with that, I'm happy to pass it back to you, Joanne.
Thank you so much, Louis, and thank you and all of your staff for the work that you've been putting into this program. I would now like to welcome Joe Goodenberry from Stratagen Consulting to present an overview of this new report. Joe.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joanne. Hi, everyone. Joe Goodenberry, Senior Manager with Stratagen Consulting, and today I'm joined by my colleagues, Eliasid Animas and Jennifer Gorman, and we'll be talking through our analysis to develop a pathway to decarbonize Pennsylvania's industrial sector. So some brief background quickly on Stratagen. We are a globally connected, impact-driven firm on a mission to decarbonize energy systems. And here, the team and I focus on decarbonization strategies, road mapping, clean energy planning, and emerging technologies, as well as jobs and economic analysis and impacts associated with an energy transition. So for this engagement, our focus was to develop a roadmap for Pennsylvania to decarbonize its industrial sector by 2050. And today we'll be walking through that analysis at a high level, touching on some key takeaways and providing additional detail on assumptions, methodologies, and findings. So we'll start with some background here on the first slide. The industrial sector is, there we go, sorry, second slide. The industrial sector is responsible for about 1/3 of CO2 equivalent emissions in the Commonwealth. The data we present here are from last year's greenhouse gas inventory based on 2019 emissions. Just a quick note that between completion of our analysis and this webinar, new data were released for 2023 based on year 2020 emissions. Although we weren't able to get those into the report, we recently did some high-level analysis using those updated data and found that although there are a few differences in the baseline, generally we don't expect the use of that latest data to meaningfully impact our pathway or our set of solutions. So looking here at the types of industrial sector emissions, that's the chart on the right, we see that there are primarily 3 types of emissions. The majority, about 60%, are due to the combustion of fossil fuels. And this is for both low temperature and high temperature heating needs. The cutoff usually between low temperature, high temperature is about 400 degrees Celsius typically. So throughout this presentation, as I say low temp, high temp, that's what I mean. Fugitive emissions from the fuel supply system, that's mostly oil and gas, along with coal. That makes up the second largest share of emissions. And then not quite 1/5 of industrial sector emissions are what we call process emissions. And these are just emissions that are created and released through industrial processes. Cement making would be a primary example of those types of emissions. So that's where we are today. We can go to the next slide here. As we approach our analysis, we need to understand what's expected in a sort of business as usual scenario so that we can look at what a decarbonization scenario would look like. So on this slide, we see that some new rules primarily aim to reduce emissions through the deployment of new technologies in the oil and gas sector. Those are expected to result in reductions in fugitive emissions, but overall, emissions from the industrial sector are still expected to rise over time, primarily due to projected emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels, which is in the dark blue chunk of this graph here, right? So for our pathway to decarbonization, we're examining emissions from all notable industrial subsectors, including fossil fuel extraction and delivery, iron and steel, minerals, chemicals, refining, pulp and paper, and glass, among many others. We can go to the next slide here. Addressing these emissions obviously required understanding the footprint of each of these industries and their subsectors. And so to do this, we relied on two primary sources of data, both the Pennsylvania Greenhouse Gas Inventory and EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. The former takes the top-down approach, but doesn't have a breakdown between process emissions and combustion emissions at the subsector level. So what we do is supplement these data with additional information from the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, which has specific emissions detail at the facility level. And so that's more of a bottom-up approach, which allows us to fill in some of the data gaps here. Through this process, we build up an emissions profile for each of the major industrial subsectors. We see here that emissions from oil and gas systems and coal mines are a primary contributor. They account for roughly 34% of industrial sector emissions, as well as the steel industry at about 11% and cement at 6%. You'll notice on the far right, we have one other major source of emissions. And I thought it'd be worth touching on this a bit. We've labeled this category as other, but what it represents is some of the difference between the top-down inventory data and the bottom-up facility level data. And based on all the data available, we can't completely fully characterize this category, except that we know that it contains stationary combustion emissions from a variety of other industrial subsectors. And because these data are ultimately collected and built up based on combustion emissions, compiled based on fuel usage estimates, we know that this category also does include some larger non-industrial fuel customers, including hospitals and universities, as well as agricultural construction. But the remainder of the emissions in this other category are assumed to be from stationary combustion of fossil fuels, really for those low heat processes and for industrial building space heating. As we know through this process of elimination, we know this basically through the process of elimination, the subsectors that require the high temperature heating, again, that's above 400 degrees Celsius. Those are already accounted for in the other data categories. So that's how we arrive at this assumption. So we can move ahead to the next slide. So to decarbonize emissions from such a wide variety of sectors and processes, unfortunately, there's no single magic bullet solution. So our methodology focused on 5 primary levers, which are shown here on this slide. You'll see in this chart that the top 3 are considered more in the near term, as they're comparatively more shovel ready and based on existing technologies that are already commercially available and economic at scale. So those would include both energy and material efficiency, as well as electrification. Energy efficiency, it includes process improvements to lower energy consumption, such as increased heat exchange efficiency, switching to more efficient technologies, and other applications to used waste heat or things like combined heat and power, right? Material efficiency includes designing products for longer use, material substitutions, and increasing material use and recycling. The idea is essentially opportunities to get more from less material, right? Efficiency is one of the most cost-effective methods to implement, and over the longer term, most of these solutions ultimately pay for themselves over time due to the savings that result on input costs. Efficiency also offers additional benefits through cost savings to consumers because it will help lower energy bills. Electrification can help provide heat for low and mid-temperature heating needs. Again, that would be less than 400 degrees Celsius. And in most cases, these solutions can be implemented immediately with existing technologies. Ultimately, the emissions reductions that you'll get from electrification are dependent on the emissions intensity of the power sector, which really highlights the importance of decarbonizing electricity generation. Was glad to hear Louis touch on that a little bit in his remarks. So for our roadmap, here at Strategen, we did assume that power generation in Pennsylvania over time will be carbon-free by 2050, with emissions decreasing linearly over that period, just based on current trends of decarbonization of the power sector, particularly the ongoing transition away from coal in Pennsylvania. And that helps highlight the added benefit of electrification is that these types of investments will accrue further over time as the grid gets cleaner and cleaner. And you'll see how that becomes more evident in our pathway analysis and results. So then over the longer horizon, we do also consider the role that hydrogen can play as an alternative fuel, as well as carbon capture and storage, which has applications in reducing some of those process emissions that I mentioned earlier, such as those that are emitted through cement making. For some subsectors, we do project ramp downs in production, particularly for fossil fuel extraction as we rely less on fossil fuels. But also the retirement of some facilities, notably in the petrochemical sector. So those have a role in reducing industrial emissions within the Commonwealth as well. And using this set of levers applied to the emissions profile and future emissions projections for each of our industrial subsectors, we at Strategen conducted a detailed decarbonization analysis based on the costs, timing, expected availability, and appropriate applications for each of these levers. Our aim here was to optimize the pathway to both minimize costs and maximize emissions reductions and other societal and economic benefits. So just want to share some high-level results here first. We see how these levers play a role over the full period, right? Based on our analysis, the pathway we've developed would reduce CO2 equivalent emissions from 2019 baseline levels by more than 18 million metric tons by 2030, or that amounts to, as we see on the slide here, 21% overall. We see here in this second bar, the 2030 bar, that's almost entirely due to reductions through efficiency improvements. That's in this sort of royal bluish color, if folks can see that, hopefully. And then electrification in the dark blue there as well. And again, we see in the later years how electrification can pay further dividends later on as the electric sector continues to get cleaner and cleaner. By 2040, some of the production ramp downs and facility and equipment retirements, those are shown in purple here, those start to appear in our pathway, as well as fuel switching to hydrogen and the use of carbon capture technologies for those process emissions primarily. By 2050, our analysis finds an 84% reduction in industrial sector emissions, as Louis mentioned earlier. Across all subsectors, transitioning from fossil fuel combustion to electrification enables roughly half of the total emissions reductions, followed by efficiency improvements, carbon capture, and fuel switching. Just one other quick caveat I want to note here, particularly for the later years. Our roadmap is based on the current landscape for each of these technologies and the levers that I outlined on the previous slide. But obviously, the development of new technologies or processes or other advancements that would make other nascent technologies more cost-effective and more scalable, those would have an impact on the roadmap ultimately, right? So I just want to plug the importance of future research and development and technological advancement. So on the next slide here, looking at the pathway on a subsector basis, we see the timing and the impact on each of these industries. Fossil fuel extraction, metals, and those low heat subsectors I outlined experience the largest reductions, but we also have emissions from the minerals, chemicals, and refining sectors that are nearly completely eliminated by 2050 in our roadmap. For this webinar, we unfortunately don't have time to go through each of the subsectors in full detail, but we did want to highlight a couple of key subsectors, particularly those where we project some significant near-term impacts. So I'm pleased to welcome my colleague at Strategen, Jennifer Gorman, and she'll talk through our pathway to decarbonize the iron and steel industry in Pennsylvania. So Jen, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. I'm excited to talk through iron and steel here. So in 2019, to give some background, Pennsylvania produced approximately 5.2 million metric tons of steel, and this resulted in 4.4% of the Commonwealth's industrial emissions. 80% of these emissions come from the production of steel, and the remainder come from the fabrication of steel into useful products. And before diving into this decarbonization pathway, I just wanted to provide some detail on the process itself and describe the sources of emissions that we're trying to address. So steel can be produced through primary or secondary processes, and these do result in different end product purities, so there are different uses for each of these processes. The production of steel in Pennsylvania is approximately split 50-50 between primary and secondary steelmaking. Primary steelmaking is the most emissions-intensive method to produce steel. This relies on blast furnace and basic oxygen furnace technologies, also known as BF-BOF, and this uses coal as a key feedstock. Separately, secondary steelmaking is characterized by the use of an electric arc furnace, so this primarily relies on electricity. The emissions from secondary steelmaking come from small amounts of fossil fuels that are used to provide initial heat and the heat used to melt steel. And there are some process emissions from lime, coal, and steel contaminants. Following the production of steel through primary or secondary processes, the metal is then put through a fabrication process, which creates steel parts or components for use in different industries. Fabrication processes are usually high heat processes that use natural gas combustion. So we're looking at three distinct processes here: primary steelmaking, secondary steelmaking, and fabrication. So as you can see on this graph, there are a variety of complementary solutions that will be needed to decarbonize this subsector. And I'm going to do a brief walkthrough of the strategy and analysis to decarbonize iron and steel. Starting with primary steelmaking, energy efficiency measures can lead to a 20% reduction in emissions by 2030, and this takes advantage of commercially available technologies. Material efficiency measures can also build upon these energy efficiency reductions, and these include increased recycling and increased use of scrap steel as an input. This could potentially lead to a 10% reduction in primary steelmaking emissions by 2050. Additionally, as I mentioned before, primary steelmaking today almost exclusively uses coal blast furnace technology, but it could alternatively be performed with a process called direct reduction of iron and electric arc furnace technology, which on this graph is seen as DRIEAF. And this is actually 38% less emissions intensive than the coal process today. DRI furnaces can run on hydrogen, or with slight retrofits could run on hydrogen, and they can also use natural gas. When you are using this DRI technology, that also makes carbon capture a possibility. Existing facilities today are not particularly suitable for carbon capture because the gas streams that are emitted are not very concentrated. But DRI technology produces concentrated flue gas streams, making carbon capture a possibility. Moving on to secondary steelmaking, the key decarbonization method here is efficiency. Efficiency-related reductions of 33% by 2050 are assumed based on the potential for process improvements and energy efficiency measures. Finally, for the fabrication process, there are also a number of efficiency solutions that can be applied, and these include waste heat recovery and retrofits of burners. This could lead to emissions reductions in the fabrication process of 20% by 2050. Additionally, for the heat input, fuel switching to hydrogen accounts for 60% of expected emissions reductions for fabrication. And of course, the low and medium temperature heat needs could be decarbonized with electrification. So across each of these processes, energy and material efficiency are the key drivers of near-term emissions reductions. And solutions like fuel switching and carbon capture come into play in the longer term. Using this combination of solutions, Strategen found that carbon dioxide emissions from Pennsylvania's iron and steel industry could be reduced by 19% by 2030 and 92% by 2050. And I'll now hand it off to my colleague Eliassi to talk through the other emissions subsector.
Thanks, Jen. Okay, so I think we should call this, lower heat subsectors. This is actually inclusive of processes that are considered low and medium heat, so below 400 degrees Celsius. And as Joe already explained, this is a major sector that was sized through a process of elimination that kind of tracks to DOE's assumptions in their national decarbonization roadmap. This subsector is responsible for about 30% of the GHG emissions in Pennsylvania, and it includes emissions from heating in the medium and small manufacturing facilities that are not covered in the EPA's GHG reporting program. For example, this includes emissions from drying processes in the paper industry, or steam creation for pasteurization in food industry, or building heating across manufacturing facilities. So a very wide range of applications. The sizing of the sector also includes emissions from non-manufacturing industrial uses like agriculture, mining, and construction. So that happens because of the data sources that we use. And something important to mention in this sector is that it uses commercially available technologies at scale. In this case, you're looking at the impact of efficiency and electrification. Efficiency is a technology that in most cases does not require major changes to the current industrial processes, and that can bring immediate solutions to the emissions. Some of the key energy efficiency improvements include efficiencies to reduce energy and increase process yields. I think you already mentioned many of these, but I will add the recovery of thermal energy and the expansion of energy management practices. For this wide range of subsectors and industries, there are assessments that need to be taken into each site to find the best solutions for each. Also importantly, these energy efficiency solutions are assumed to be cost-effective and come at no net cost. So that means that the monetary benefits of using them, installing them, are higher than the costs when you see in a life of when you consider the life of the improvements. The second technology and the most impactful in here is electrification, and these include technologies like induction, radiative heating, and heat pumps. Heat pumps, for example, can satisfy a wide range of thermal demands in the low and medium temperature across the different industries. These are usually built ad hoc for each industry. And while these are still expensive from a CapEx perspective, they are highly efficient. So they can also be really cost effective, especially in the longer term. Over 50% of all of this manufacturing energy, or 50% of the manufacturing energy used in the thermal processing, sorry, let's reframe this. For all of the energy used in the manufacturing processes, about 50% is used for thermal uses, and less than 5% of these operations are electrified. So that implies that there's like a huge potential for electrification to become an important solution here. Also, you will notice that this graph kind of grows, I wouldn't say exponentially, but grows really fast going into the future. And that's because as investments are made on electrification, it's easier to leverage the investments made into cleaning the grid. So you are seeing that the savings of emissions grow exponentially. Finally, this path, among all the other ones, is the less disruptive. And it's unlikely that it will have major impacts on processes because of the gradual changes that will happen in the normal course of businesses. It's expected that as the equipment used in the industry goes through their useful time of life, they will be renovated, and that's when these technologies can be adopted. So Strategy estimates that the implementation cost of this category will be around the $14–15 billion. Again, that's mostly the cost of electrifying this sector. And we can go to the next slide now. And back to you, Joe.
Yeah, thanks so much, LAC. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Jen, for sharing those deep dives on those industries. We really think those are representative of how we approached each subsector in detail. And I do encourage folks to access the full report for more detail on those two industries, as well as the other industrial subsectors in our pathway analysis. So I do want to touch on some additional high-level findings we have. I shared earlier that Strategen's pathway will reduce industrial sector emissions in Pennsylvania by approximately 21% by 2030 and 84% by 2050. In addition, we estimate that the cost to implement this roadmap will be approximately $35 billion. I think Louis alluded to that number earlier. I just want to note that number is absent of subsidies, so we view this as an unsubsidized estimate. There are federal subsidies that may be available to eligible projects through mechanisms such as the 45Q and the 48C tax credits, but given the limited timing window of some of those programs as they're expected to sunset, and their potential applications on a project-by-project basis, as well as in the case of 48C, those funds do run out. So we didn't feel comfortable assuming that it would apply across the board, and we don't expect those subsidies to have a tremendous impact on our pathway costs regardless, again, because they're primarily for technologies that don't come into play till further down the line. Of the industrial subsectors that we examined for our analysis, the minerals, steel, and oil and gas industries are expected to be the most costly to decarbonize. But on the flip side, failure to decarbonize can have a tremendous impact through the economic value of environmental damages, or avoided environmental damages, I should say. As part of our analysis, we estimate that absent these emissions reductions, that these emissions reductions would result in avoided annual damages that would surpass $14 billion by 2050. This is based on the social cost of carbon, which accounts for the costs associated with climate change, which includes human health impacts, changes in agricultural productivity, property damage from natural disasters, disruption of energy services, and other impacts. From an environmental justice standpoint, several of the near-term shovel-ready levers in our pathway, again, including industrial efficiency measures and electrification, those have the potential to reduce local criteria pollutants like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter that can result from industrial facilities and can impact local communities. Our analysis didn't include detailed geospatial mapping to try to quantify these impacts directly, but I just wanted to highlight their importance here and the tremendous community impact that decarbonization can have in reducing local pollutants. Through an economics lens, the shift away from fossil fuels will, of course, lead to some restructuring in the state's economy, namely the loss of some job opportunities in fossil sectors, which really calls to the importance of programs to support a just transition of these workers and partner with existing training programs available through trade schools and organized labor to help reapply relevant skill sets and develop new worker capabilities. Importantly, the Pennsylvania DEP's Clean Energy Employment Report did find that unions are interested in opportunities for skills transfer in select technologies, including energy efficiency, carbon capture, and hydrogen, which does offer some encouragement that these technologies can provide logical applications for existing workers to leverage their expertise. And of course, we know from national level research conducted by the Department of Energy that industrial decarbonization has the potential to create hundreds of thousands of US jobs, particularly in skilled trade professions where, Pennsylvania has a pretty robust workforce, things like welders, electricians, metal workers, certainly boiler making, pipe fitting. The scale up of renewable energy in the electric sector that would be needed to support electrification is also expected to lead to job growth. But really, and probably most importantly, energy efficiency improvements, which are featured quite heavily in our pathway here. Those in particular tend to have an outsized impact on local economies, simply because the majority of these projects are typically performed by local workforce. You can go to the next slide here. I just want to wrap up by highlighting some enabling actions that can help facilitate industrial decarbonization in the state. In the near term, as I already mentioned a few times before, we recommend focusing on proven and cost-effective solutions that are ready to be implemented at scale. So again, in the near term, that's energy efficiency improvements, electrification, as well as some technological improvements in the oil and gas sector. Of course, with increased electrification, that also makes it more critical to continue the state's path towards phasing out fossil fuels in the power sector. In terms of planning and funding, in the near term, we don't specifically recommend programs that would deliberately exclude particular industrial subsectors or technology solutions, simply because the goal here is to maximize flexibility and encourage program participation. However, we would caution against funding the implementation of solutions that have already been economic for a while, or they may already be required by existing law. The idea here is that you don't want to double count actions that are already in progress or should have already been made. The other key piece here is to start early in pursuing community and worker engagement. That's both to maximize community benefits and also limit externalities that can occur for local populations. Investing early in training and job placement programs to leverage workers' existing skill sets and support a just transition is also a key near-term action. Over the longer term, in addition to the full or near full decarbonization of the power sector, we do think more research is needed, both on the development of new technologies or improvements to reduce costs in some of those nascent technologies, but also more research is needed in understanding fully the air quality impacts of technologies such as hydrogen and carbon capture. So with that, I know we have about 15 minutes left. I do want to pause here, and I'll conclude this section of the presentation here to allow for some Q&A. So I want to thank everyone for their attention, and I'll hand it back to Joanne now.
Thank you so much, Joe. And thanks also to Jen and Eliasid. We really appreciate you being on today to share your expertise. We do have a few questions in the Q&A, so I'll get started with those. And then as people are thinking and processing everything, please do feel free to continue adding questions. The first question is for Louis. Are the GGERBs paid based on a proposed or actual emission above the 20% target?
That's a great question. So currently, the way that we're hoping the program would operate is, project proposals would be submitted to us and we would have to evaluate them for technical and financial feasibility. So in that project proposal, they would have to specify how many emissions they anticipate reducing with the project. But then at the close of the project, we would also be performing measurement and verification to certify that the emissions that they proposed were actually the emissions that were reduced. So it's a little bit of both.
Thank you. The next question is for the Stratagen team. Aside from cost, what are the main barriers that you identified as standing in the way of success for the roadmap? And do you have any recommendations for attendees on how we can address those barriers?
Sure. Yeah. Maybe I'll go first, but I'll invite Jen and LEC to chime in as well briefly too. But yeah, of course, cost is the number one barrier, and more funding is needed across the board, of course, and the right incentives in place. But with that too, with that cost being a barrier, it's important to have match funding or partnership funding available. So you have subsidies or other programs, incentive programs that help bring folks to the table, and you get private investment too that makes that possible. But aside from costs, I really think the important piece here is community and stakeholder engagement that can help enable any of these changes here. And that I'm speaking very broadly to that. I mean, stakeholder meeting, engaging early and often with industrial actors too on the industry side, but also with communities who are going to experience some of these impacts. And certainly, particularly with other partners within these communities, organized labor, trade schools, to help bring about this transition. Because, I did allude to, we're not pretending that there aren't some potential negative impacts of this transition for some populations. And so it's important in order to get folks on board with this and enable these things to have effective and meaningful outreach and engagement with interested stakeholders, or affected stakeholders, I should say. But Jen, anything to add there?
Yeah, and I think Joe alluded to this earlier, but also just from a technical and grid standpoint, electrification is a great solution for these low temperature heat needs. But without rapid decarbonization of the electric power system, you're not seeing the decarbonization benefits from electrification come into play right in the near term. So we were finding, with more rapid power sector decarbonization, you're really seeing outsized impacts in the industrial subsector in the near term. So that's also a great focus area.
And LEC, anything to add? If not, I can mention technology too, but.
And maybe a small remark, as we mentioned, energy efficiency solutions are already cost effective. So just information and like ease of implementation for many of the manufacturing sites will accelerate the deployment of that.
Yeah, and I'll just touch back on one other thing. I think this is with trying to decarbonize any sector, it's always that last mile that's the hardest, right? It's where there's the least number of options, it's the most expensive. And so just continued technological advancement, demonstration projects, et cetera, funding to help R&D. Louis or Joanne, if you have any other things to point to for this question too, I'm curious. But
Louis, anything on your end?
I was actually already one question ahead. I saw there was another question targeted for me, so I'll just wait to chime in on that one.
Yeah, we can go there now. So there's a question for you about community benefits as part of the RISE PA program. So will community benefits be included as a baseline requirement for recipients or only a bonus? And how will the grant work in frontline communities to make sure that they're receiving benefits from funded projects?
Both excellent questions. And what we're contemplating in terms of the evaluation criteria, sort of the baseline standards that all the proposals will have to address, we do have a section where applicants will have to articulate the environmental and community outputs, outcomes, and performance measures associated with their project, including the expected measurable community benefits. They'll have to propose how they'll do their project tracking and have a measurement plan and implementation timeline, as well as describe what are the specific benefits going to be for the low income and vulnerable communities, the energy communities, and they'll definitely have to specify whether their project will have any disbenefits to those communities. So the idea with the community benefits bonus is that you have to go above and beyond those baselines, and it will require robust engagement with the communities to hear directly from them what benefits they want to see and make sure those benefits are realized.
Thanks, Berg. I appreciate that.
Thank you. And then a question for the Strategen team. In figure 1, when you shift the industrial load on the electric grid, do you account for emissions in the power generation sector? Was the required growth in renewables considered? And if so, that unabated coal and gas power do not cater to that increased load?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, for this endeavor here, we didn't do heavy power sector modeling. We did do that, just to plug a prior report we did for Southwestern Pennsylvania with a clean energy pathway for that region, which is where a lot of the oil and gas, the coal-fired and gas-fired generation exists. But no, for this, I mean, we do account for, as I mentioned earlier, but I might not have been super clear on it anyway. When we're counting the emissions impacts, we are assuming a decarbonization trend occurring, so that load growth isn't being met by coal or gas that would otherwise be going offline potentially, right, with current trends. And so we didn't then go back and remodel the power sector of that feedback loop. So that's a great point by Hari here. And it would be a great area for further research because, look, I don't mean to undersell the importance of that and the cost and the impact of that. That is a tremendous effort in decarbonizing, especially as we're adding large loads through electrification. But I will also shamelessly plug our other report because we did account for, in that report, electrification of both the transportation sector and the building sector in Southwestern Pennsylvania. And you can see how that's accounted for in a clean energy pathway for the power sector. But one other thing to add, the $35 billion number does not include power sector costs, the costs of transitioning there. So that is another key point to a key distinction to make in this analysis, but and a great question, if I'm understood it correctly. Claire.
Thank you. Following on that question, there's a question in the chat about whether the analysis includes Scope 3 supply chain emissions. I don't know if anyone is able to address that question.
Yeah, we didn't look at those at all, to my knowledge. LAC, if we considered it at one point, let me know, but that wasn't a part of our analysis.
So Scope 3 emissions are emissions related to downstream impacts of or upstream impacts of the industrial sector. We didn't include them. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, important slice of emissions to highlight, though, for sure.
And then we have an additional question. What steps can electrical transmission and distribution utilities take to be proactive for this transition, given the massive grid upgrades required for many electrification solutions and the regulatory mandates on how ratepayer dollars are spent?
Louis, I welcome any thoughts too, if you have any.
I do. And those would be they should definitely keep their eyes peeled on some federal funding opportunities coming out of the Department of Energy for grid upgrades, grid modernization. They have their grid innovation program. The acronym there is GRIP, and that is yearly open through the next 4 years, I believe. There's currently round 2 is accepting proposals. So these types of upgrades that are going to be needed to be made are very expensive, which is again, cost is the huge barrier here. So while we're in this like once in a generation, federal funding, dollars flying through the ether, snag as many of those as you can. And I know that we've heard from DOE directly that they're really looking for innovative solutions, not companies that are just trying to fund projects they would do anyways, vegetation management type things. So it's definitely worth their time to keep their ear close to the ground for when the solicitations are coming down the pike.
Yeah, thanks for that, Louis. And one thing I'll add, and I'll give LEC a chance to chime in if you'd like, but I think this is a great question and a really hard one to answer too, right? But it does call for the need over time, and really we need to start now with increased coordination between sectors here, as everything is now sort of becoming one large, how we're defining energy and how that delineates from power and not power, it is all, those areas are gray, right? As everything becomes more interconnected. And so no pun intended with interconnection either, but I think it really does highlight the need for continued coordination through that too, so that we're not, so that all the impacts from one sector to another are properly understood and strategically planned for. So that's sort of a non-answer answer, I suppose. But LEC, anything to add?
Maybe I'll add that here it will be important to consider the potential of on-site clean generation and storage for these sites. As we've seen for, in the power sector, that usually comes with the potential to defer or avoid some transmission and distribution costs. So those sensitivities we didn't model for this exercise. Again, it will be super interesting to look at that. And from the cost perspective, I think, that's an interesting question. We are looking at that in other processes across the country. But I don't have like any details to share in here, an easy answer to give. It will definitely be a challenge.
Well, I would like to thank you all so much. Miraculously, we made it through the presentation and all of the questions in the allotted time that we have today. So extra points for time management, but thanks everyone again so much. Thank you, Louis, for all the work you're doing at the state level. Thanks to the Stratagen team for your excellent research and extremely helpful information to help guide our next phase of decarbonization in Pennsylvania.
Thanks everyone so much, and I want to thank Orby for the opportunity here. This was a pleasure of a project to work on, and also thanks to Louis for joining us and the great work they're doing over at DEP.
And all I have to say is go team.
Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks
so
everyone.
much.